But in terms of literary writing, which I think is probably a more accurate title. It's a remarkable lineup we have here. Starting at the far end, we have Eka Kurniawan. I'm sure I mangled your name, but a terrific Indonesian writer. He was on the Man Booker long list for his novel of leading anti-apartheid activists, and her writing and fiction combines political and human insight. Daniyal Mueenuddin, a Pakistani, everyone knows who Daniyal is. I don't need to introduce you, but it's a treat to have you here. And your panel earlier was just a treat to listen to, and I'm glad you're here. And Teju Cole, Nigerian-American writer, the author of two novels, two beautiful novels, most recently Open City, and also a photographer and an art historian. And he has coined, I think, the phrase of the conference when he called Donald Trump earlier the Ebola of 2017. At any rate, I think I'd like to start by starting with you at the end, telling us maybe a bit about what you're working on now and how it's affected when what's changed? We have to sit down and work on a piece of writing in this current political climate. How difficult is it to keep your mind on what you're doing and not sort of check your news feed every 5 minutes? How is politics? How has it changed the way you go about your current project, and has it changed your current project?
I think it's always very difficult for writers to write something happens right now. So when I wrote my first novel, it's actually I written back to very far away to Indonesia, when in the very beginning, in the end of colonialism. So I think because it's easier to do because there is a long distance between writers' time and the story. But in my recent time, I tried to write some contemporary Indonesians deal with the Indonesian political situations, Indonesian society. I tried to make a little trick a bit because, like I said, I wrote something. It's physically different from what I really live my own life. For example, my third novel is about the truck driver. I'm not a truck driver, so I think it's easier to create a distance to make how the truck driver see the Indonesian situation, political, socially. So I think that's what I try to do right now, to see the contemporary the political situation in the time at the same time with my own life.
Gillian?
Well, novels can take me quite a long time to write, and so to make them absolutely topical in a way doesn't work for me, although I do think that fiction is about the truth, and often you write a novel that has resonance in the present and the future, even if it's set in the past. But one of the things that I do, which is much more contemporary than that, is that I do these verbatim plays, which are plays that are based on people's testimony. And so this year I did one that was put on at the National Theatre in London, which was on why youth from our world, by which I mean from Europe, would go and join Islamic State. What was it that pushed them there? I did one before in 2004 on Guantanamo, and I did one on the London riots of 2011. And that, I suppose, is my way of talking directly to political happenings that are happening, except I'm using other people's words to frame my story. It's a dangerous thing to do because while I was here, I mean, when I was doing Another World, which is the one on Islamic State children, we went to Belgium and interviewed a whole lot of mothers of people whose kids had gone to join Islamic State. And while we were rehearsing, we discovered that one of the mothers we'd interviewed, her beautiful son had gone to Islamic State, and then he had been part of the Paris bombers. And I suppose it gives it gave me an understanding of where this comes from, or what drives somebody to do something like that, and that's what I think it can give an audience. And while I've been here, I've had another example, which is when I did the Guantanamo plays. I interviewed a British resident, a British person who had been in Guantanamo, by a man by the name of Jamal al-Harith. He was a convert to Islam who'd gone to Pakistan to learn more about his religion. This is his story, and I do believe it actually. Ended up trying to get away during the American and British bombing of Afghanistan because people said, "You're British, you should get out of here." Got sold to the Taliban, went to a Taliban, was put in a Taliban prison, freed by the Red Cross when the Taliban ran away, and ended up in Guantanamo for 3 years. Came out, I interviewed him when he came out, a man in total shell shock. And the other day I read in the paper that he just did a suicide bombing in Iraq.
Let me quickly rephrase my question before we get to you, Daniyal. I guess I'm not suggesting that a literary writer should do anything at all different. I'm just wondering, first of all, about your current projects and whether it's now different to sit down each morning at the computer. Does it change the way you felt about whatever you're working on, the current climate? I guess it's more accurately my question. So, Daniyal.
I think the problem with political writing is that it is sort of a marching call for the people who agree with you, and is sort of noise for the people who don't agree with you. So I don't think, at least, of course, the tent is very large and there's place for all of us. But certainly from my perspective, I don't believe that there's any political component to what I do except observation. There's a bearing witness aspect to it. But beyond that, I certainly try, that's not this place where I write from, the place that, of course, like all of us, I was devastated by the election of Donald Trump. But the place that I write from has very little to do with those sentiments.
You've just finished a novel, as I understand?
Yeah, I've just finished a novel, which is, it's a story that could have been written 100 years ago, or 300 years ago, or 500 years ago, which is sort of the story of a girl who, by luck and by pluck, makes her way in the world.
The loss of language, that even given an account of that in language, I find myself hesitating and stuttering. So after the election, I experienced something that was almost like aphasia, where I just could not get access to my language. And I think it's because in the immediate aftermath, there was just all this realization of how deep this was going to go, how many different things would get affected. Not only is it affecting healthcare in the US, but it's also affecting climate change long term. It's also affecting what possible wars the country might get into, but it's also affecting the question of civil rights in the US for various minorities, but it's also affecting issues of immigration. And everything had gotten swept up simply because of the amount of power Americans had concentrated in the executive, and at the same time, how much real power the United States had in the world. So one event happened and it had consequences for 100 different things. So I woke up the next morning. I'm not ashamed to say I cried. I think a lot of people I know wept.
I think one of the questions everybody says is, how many times did you cry after the Trump election?
Yeah, I think that's a fair question, In my case, it was 3.
Me too, thrice.
First 2 days, and then the morning of the so-called Muslim ban, I was in New York, and a lot of my friends were at JFK, and I started getting reports from there. I mean, when you just feel like your country burning around you, everybody here knows that feeling to a certain extent. It's just very, very startling. In any case, I could not write at all anything for about 3 days. And the first thing I was able to write was about, I had to start thinking about how to write about not writing, you know, slowly then coming out of that space. So yeah, my short answer is that it's very hard. It's still hard now, because I still have moments. In my earlier panel, I was talking about the day after tomorrow. When this is all over, why have we done it? What have we tried to preserve? What has been worth keeping? And writing is one of the answers, but it's very hard to get there because right now a lot of it feels superfluous.
I know, Teju, you've written some essays since the election. Are you working on fiction since? Were you working on a project?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the strange thing is that before the election, I mean, I always have a couple of different projects going on, and I'm very interested in photography and how texts interact with photography. I wasn't working on a novel, but after the election, in the weeks that followed, I started working on a project that I can't really call it a novel. It has a visual element to it. A lot of it is drawn from life, but a lot of it is shaped like a story. And it's very, very involved with dreams. And it's totally a response to the present moment. But it's basically a project about illegibility, which is not fun for me to write. And it's not going to be fun for anybody to read. But that feels like thinking about what doesn't make sense, thinking about illegibility is somehow something I want to do at length. So that's what I'm working on.
Gillian, how do you manage to work on plays and a novel at the same time?
I don't. I work on a play. The plays take much less time. So I work on a play. A novel takes me a lot of time to think about, and a lot of time to shape, and a lot of time then to decide, to realize what it's really supposed to be, and therefore to write it that way. So I don't. I do them in tandem, but I don't do them at the same time. But can I just take up something that you said, which is that if you write politically, you are writing for those who agree with you. I actually don't agree with that. And as we said before, let's have a fight on the stage.
Excellent.
And part of the reason what I was thinking as you were talking is, I was thinking about one of my favorite books, Anna Karenina. Now, Anna Karenina appears to be a book about, you know, this tragic woman, this tragic marriage, this tragic end to this woman's life. It is also about agriculture in Russia. And if you read it today, you can read the history of what happened in the Soviet Union. And I think Tolstoy wrote about that because it was his political passion, reform of the land. I don't, you know, for us, it has stayed the test of time over many years.
I think that a lot of us would agree that the parts of War and Peace that we sort of skim over are the sections in which he describes his philosophy of the history of philosophy of history. And similarly, I think that sometimes even in Anna Karenina, he gets on his hobby horse, and his hobby horse is this political activism that he espouses. But later in his life, when Tolstoy, I mean, the last good thing Tolstoy wrote was Resurrection, and even that is sort of slightly overripe. So I don't think that Tolstoy was a better writer because of his politics. I think he was the greatest fiction writer despite his politics.
Tolstoy, as you all know, had a great middle-class readership. And a question I'd like to ask all of you is, how often do you feel that you are, in a way, as fiction writers, preaching to an elite audience, preaching to so few people in this world actually read serious fiction? When do you feel good about the fact, or how often, that you're reaching people who aren't the typical book reader? How often do you get these feelings sometimes that you've reached someone you're not just preaching to the converted, I guess, people who already care deeply about literature. Eka?
I always believe that we tend to preach each others, but as a novelist, I think it's just about how to preach as cool as it be. So the readers didn't think that I'm preaching to them. So it's something tricky, and it's about technique, how you preach to the others, but it's not look like a preaching.
Gillian?
Yeah, I mean, I agree on the preaching, but if you're talking about reaching audiences...
Yeah, that's what I mean.
Yeah, it is clear that you are... I mean, first of all, if you're talking about the world, there is a great deal of illiteracy in this world, where people don't have the tools to read books, and there's a great deal of poverty where people don't have the access to books. And so I think in many ways you are writing to a book readership that is more privileged. But I do think even doing that, you reach people who have very different life experiences, and books change people, you know, and they may only change an individual here and an individual there, but they do. They can open the world for people.
Daniel?
I think it's a great question, but I think that the problem is I don't think we choose our audiences. I think that, you know, we write from a very private place, and therefore, you know, you hope for a broader audience, and you hope that your audience will, you know, be composed of, you know, a very heterogeneous selection of people. But I don't think that's where it comes from.
And this might sound dreadfully elitist of me, but my books are only for people who read books.
Indeed.
You know, people who don't read books, I don't really worry about them.
And I think that is true of all of us,
Does,
really.
does your audience ever surprise you? Do people come to your readings, the people you expect to come? I mean, are you sometimes...
It's no longer surprising because I expect my audience to look like any possible thing. Nothing is surprising about it, you know, gender, age, or race, or appearance, or even educational background. It has to be somebody who wants to be in a space with a book. But that is a very hard thing to predict. What happens when you leave another human being alone with a book? Something very intense and very personal can happen to them that is interfacing with their own personal history in a way that you would not have been able to predict. Because really what people are responding to in the book usually is not its cultural markers or even necessarily the plot, but it's like the small little flicks and the little touches that, elevated from being just a report into a work that has some art in it.
Teju, I think that, I mean, if you're going to say that you're a political, I think what you're trying to do is destroy complacencies, and that's a very political act. And, you know, that's where you reach an audience who is unlike you and is, you know, can be moved.
This question, go ahead, please.
Yeah, actually, that's a bit complicated. I mean, I think it's good in all our work to try to make people think bigger, destroy their complacency. That's not usually the first thing I think about with the work I really like to do. The first thing I think about is that this will go out to someone out there and they'll be consoled by it. So not in order to educate them, but in order to create a space where I can be with them and they feel some consolation.
It can be both, you know.
No, oh, absolutely.
Yeah. And I think it is both. I mean, look, you know, anybody who reads books, we were all sort of geeks, and you know, at 13 and 15 and 17, we were trying to figure out who we were, and these books broke, you know, all sorts of barriers for us.
That's right. Baldwin says that you think you're all alone in the world. You think you're the only person who has suffered, and then you read a book.
Yeah.
And I think what's so great about it is you actually read a book on your own.
Yes.
You know, so that you get that feeling of joining with something, some other bigger than you, but you actually are on your own when you do it, and you do it in your own time. That's certainly, for me, why I read when I was young, and why I read now, is to be with myself and the writer, and this thing that is bigger than the writer, because I make it mine as well.
You read the book alone?
I read a book alone, yeah.
Because
You
my
read a book on the tube?
manservants, my manservants, they have a little
They read it
chorus.
for you.
Yeah.
Hold on. Are you saying that reading books is a sort of a solace for loneliness?
No.
I'm trying to be provocative.
Well, that could be, right? Why not? What do you think?
But I think even if writing or reading a book is being alone, so I think when we read a book, we face, we see the word, at least the word in the novel, for example, in the multi-perspective, because there is a few characters in the novel, for example. As a writer, myself, when I write something, I try to see the word in the novel in the very different perspective, because there is, for example, there's 10 characters, so I try to see the issue, the theme, the word from the 10 perspective. So I try. It look like I see the word is bigger than what really I am.
Yep.
I'm going to ask Eka a question,
Please.
if that's okay. Because you also, your relationship with privacy and public in writing is also affected by the fact that you write for television in Indonesia.
Yeah.
You write soap operas.
Yes. I am. Yeah, I think
So that's not very private.
it's very different.
Yeah.
Yeah. When I write a book, it's very private. I'm being alone. Even if I write in the public space, I don't speak with the others. But when I write for soap opera, for example, I have to discuss with the director, with the casting, with the producer. So it's involved others, people.
Let me ask a different question. Has what's been happening in the world for the last year or two changed what you each want to read? Not talking about what you're writing now, but has it changed your reading habits in any way? Please answer in any order.
I actually think that I've had a phase of reading more non-fiction for a while, and that probably is a direct result of sort of having to think about the world in a very different way and not wanting to go into somebody else's fictional world, wanting sort of to stay in the world and understand it in a broader way. So I'm a traditional fiction reader. I'm not been a non-fiction reader, but I do think that I am reading more non-fiction, and I am also noticing that fiction writers, and Teju is one of them, are mixing fiction and fact and non-fiction in the same book, in the books that they're writing. And I think that also is about trying to work out what on earth is happening in this world of ours.
And are you talking about journalism, Gillian?
Let me say, I think what you were talking about is about responsibility. And I think that we've suddenly are feeling more responsible. Our blitheness has been swept slightly away.
No, I agree completely. I'm just wondering, the news happens so quickly now. I wonder, even nonfiction books suddenly seem dated 2 months after they're published. I'm wondering what you go to, Gillian, to read nonfiction. What kind of things are you curious about now? And what do you...
Well, I tend to read around what I'm working on at the time, but also I read books about what is history books about, in order to try and understand where we are now. And yeah, I do think this is about the fact that, well, I don't know about the rest of you, but I got brought up in a very specific way, where I understood politics in a very specific way, because I got brought up in South Africa, and sort of because of what my parents did, very integrated into the anti-apartheid struggle, into the struggle actually for democracy. It's now called the anti-apartheid struggle. It used to be called the revolution. And I I understood the world in a certain way of what was going to happen. And that understanding has stood me in very good stead for a very long time. It doesn't stand me in quite as good stead now as it used to. And I think that is partly because, you know, we're in another phase of I mean, I certainly think, for example, in England, we're in a phase where the silent majority is becoming the angry vocal majority. I mean, leftists used to be the angry people. Now rightists are the angry people, and you know, talking about how they have been crushed and therefore their voices should be heard. And I think it has required a reorientation and therefore reading in a different kind of way.
Anyone else have a comment about reading habits now?
With the news feed, I'm facing day by day so very fast. So I think I cannot read any kind of book about the contemporary issue anymore because you know it's easier to find masses. So nowadays I just read classic novels, Dostoevsky again, and something like that. So I think because I think it helped me to see the word no from the different perspective. From even we know that Dostoevsky, for example, didn't think about what happened really now. What happened really now, but I think we can see those characters we face in the Indonesian political or world political from his character, for example. It's funny for me to see the link between the fictional characters from Lomtang Ejo with the character we face today.
I mean, I feel that I really wish I could give
the proper sort of mature answers you guys are giving to this question. The reality is that my concentration has been shit. I have a very hard time picking up an entire book and reading it. I'm reading in fragments. Like stitching together the pieces of life has just been hard. Like there's so much work to do. I do my criticism, I look at photos, I take pictures, I do my own writing. There's been a lot of emotional necessity to reach out to friends and family and support them. And concentration has just been very, very hard. I mean, you're a book critic. How do you do it? You know?
He has to.
I'm so obsessed with the news, though. I just since I've been here, I can't stay off of Twitter even now. And,
right.
And of course, the data roaming charges are $4 billion. So when I return home, I'll have to pay for it.
I know a good plan. I'll talk to you.
Okay.
But yeah,
I'll walk out and just see what, my God, what's happening.
But this is exactly what it is. It's like, I mean, there's the world of you want to be absorbed in Crime and Punishment. There's some long novel. I want to read Madame Bovary again. But the reality is, you actually say to yourself, it's 2 hours since I went online. What the fuck has he done now? You know, that's actually my reading. It's the WTF has he done now? Is most of my reading.
And actually, my experience has also been, although it is true that I'm reading a lot more non-fiction to try and understand, I'm also doing something that I used to do a lot of and stopped doing, is I'm reading thrillers. And the reason is they're easy reads and they keep me going and I don't care about them and I'm just reading them in order to read and feel comforted, and it doesn't matter what happens in the end. So,
hold on, guys. Isn't just this a blip? I mean, it's not a revolution, it's just a moment of bad taste.
No, well, the blip is him, but
it could be a long
the revolution is our social media habits, which is news all the time, which is not always about him. Yeah, but the fact that there's this endless supply, we're hooked up to it, right? It's like the morphine is just coming in all the time.
And from a English perspective, the blip isn't him. He has made the blip much worse, but from an English perspective, the blip is Brexit.
You had Brexit, yeah.
I don't have any figures, but are fiction writers worried that we've been talking about how we're all gravitating towards nonfiction, perhaps more news. Are fiction writers concerned that the audience might not be there in the same way it was because of what's happening? Any of you have any thoughts about that? That people might not be as eager to read, to disappear into a novel as they might have been before? Or do you think that the opposite is true?
You know, when this was said, I mean, it's been said in many ways, but when it was said maybe around 4 or 5 years ago, by Philip Roth, for example, that the readership was going, I thought he was being a bit of an old codger about it, and people still want to engage. I know I still want to engage. Now I think there's a real difference. Something has changed. I mean, you do have to think that if you write a 400-page novel, that the readership will be smaller because people are glued to their phones. I mean, it's the reality. And a lot of the reading they're doing is on that.
Teju, the issue isn't the politics. The issue is the machine by which we read. Attention spans are reduced.
And the issue is
Precisely, yeah.
also...
Yeah, which is exactly what you're saying.
And it's also...
But I don't think it's politics.
But
No, it's not politics.
It's also how the industry has changed, because with the death of bookshops, how do you work out what you read? And I think the publishing industry is having enormous trouble trying to work out how to bring books to readers' attentions. Topical books are easier. Novels are more difficult in that way. I'm hoping they are going to solve the problem.
I mean, there is this tension between the technology and the various ways in which attention span happens, right? So if you go to whatever, Kawali performance, and it's 2 hours, you sit there and you listen for 2 hours. It's what it is. If somebody recites an epic poem and it's ancient Greece and it takes, 8 hours or 8 days, that's how long it takes. But there's something about that spending every free moment for an entire week with a particular novel, with a 600-page novel. I think it gets harder and harder to do that. And that change is real. On the other hand, the human hunger for consolation, for intensity, for density, for poetic language that meets your psychosocial need, that is not going to go away. I just don't know if... I notice that, when do I get to stay inside a book for 4 hours without interruption? Do you know when it happens? On a plane. Do you know why? No Wi-Fi.
But just to sort of bring a different perspective, I like what James Merrill said, the poet James Merrill said, why dynamite the pond when you can just catch the silver carp? And I think that's, as a sort of practicing writer, there's an aspect to that. I'm not sure I even care that you have a larger audience or a smaller one or a distracted one.
That's right.
Teju, you were for a long time a committed and very talented contributor to Twitter. And many people followed your tweets, and they were lovely. You've stopped, and I wonder if there was a reason why you stopped. We're talking about short attention span. We're talking about different things. I'm just wondering if for you there was something about it that detracted from other work, or I'm just curious.
Yeah, it's slightly complicated. I think it got... it was good, I enjoyed it, and I didn't want to rely on it. I didn't want people to say, oh, remember back when he was good at Twitter? So I like to quit when I'm ahead. But also, I have the inclination and I have the privilege of following the work, like the work I want to do. This project I described that I'm working on about illegibility, probably Random House doesn't want to publish that, because it's going to be very weird and strange, but it's the work I want to do. And so I just have this sense of following my instinct and doing the work I want to do next, and honoring that, and knowing that that's a privilege. So Twitter was good, I did it, and it's over. I don't have to overthink it. When I wake up and it's over, I know it's over.
Daniyal, you said in a panel earlier that your new novel is about a girl from Wisconsin in the United States. Her name is Crystal, which is quite a lower class name. I'm wondering, how do you know, what is your attachment to that part of America, and do you know crystals? I guess is what I'm saying.
All right, fair enough. First of all, I've spent a lot of time in Wisconsin, and I do know Crystal. I've spent a lot of time in Wisconsin because my grandfather is from Wisconsin, and we used to go there summers and so on. And yes, I know Crystal, except Crystal was actually not a girl, it was a guy. This guy I used to hang out with. And he lived across the hill from where we lived, and his house was one of those houses, which I know it's a cliche, but they were literally, demo derby cars painted up and welded down and scattered all over the yard, and donkeys and hounds. And this guy and I became friends, and that's where it began.
I feel like this panel lends itself to questions from the audience more than any panel I've been to today. Can we get some questions? Do we have a microphone? Is that possible? Could someone raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question to the entire group or to any individual writer?
My name is Moya Jaffrey. I'm a journalist and a student of public policy. The question that when I came in, I have this understanding regarding with the title of the session, Far Right, Far Out, and writing in a different word. My understanding was that we'd most probably
be talking about the fact that the global rise of the anger sentiment of the more conservative across the world, and how is that going to affect the literature of the future. So, not really sure if we've actually gone down that lane properly, but still, I'd like to ask that as most of you have mentioned that you don't look forward to who exactly is going to be your audience, you just write straight out of your heart. But when it comes to interpretation and rejection of work, or like you said, it's a dangerous thing, or you can't really predict what happens to a person when you leave him with a book alone.
Are you asking us if we read Dwight Garner's reviews?
What?
Are you asking us if we read Dwight Garner's reviews?
Yeah, kinda, yeah. Not exactly down that lane, but what I really want to know is that do you fear that the future of literature too, like the public sentiment, is most probably going to be public serving towards that fascism or that rise of extreme far right?
Anyone?
I mean, in relation to, do I take notice of the criticism? Yes and no. I take notice of criticism that speaks to me. I don't take notice of criticism that doesn't speak to me. But I had an experience when I first did my first book, which I think was very good for me as a writer, which is, I wrote a detective novel. It was published. I got a small review. It was pretty good to get a review at all for a first novel. And in this small review, it said in brackets, and Gillian Slovo is a bitch. And it was like, you expect all sorts of things, but you do not expect to be personally attacked for being a bitch. I don't know what it was. Possibly I had taken from life in a way I no longer do, and somebody thought that I had done something to somebody that they knew. And it was good for me because I have never had a review as bad as that again.
What sort of newspaper would print that?
It was actually Time Out. Do you remember Time Out in England?
Right.
Before it became a free magazine. I don't know if they printed it.
My God, I need to up my game.
I think there were.
Oh, sorry.
Well, it's called irreverence, I think. I mean, your question is fair about, the far right and nationalism. It's very hard to do that on a panel, I think, and I think there's some value in writers actually just thinking seriously about where are they right now? Where are we? How are we approaching the practice? I actually, in a way, this is my answer to the far right is to try to understand what I'm doing with my work. It's a candle in the dark, but I'm not responsible for vanquishing the darkness. I'm responsible for my candle, though, you know, which for me is sort of the difference between hope and optimism. I believe in hope, but not, you know, not in optimism.
I mean, I think what's interesting about the title of this panel is far right, far out, is the problem is the far right is no longer far out. You know, that we have, certainly in Britain, we have UKIP, which is the party that says it isn't racist, but is quite clearly a party based on racism, that is being beaten by our government, who is using the same arguments as UKIP, and a left-wing leader of a Labour Party who was never going to be anti-immigration, becoming anti-immigration because that's what they think that the writers, that the electorate wants. So I'm afraid that I think we're living in a world where far right isn't far out. And
That's right. I agree.
Have we had any fiction at all, any real fiction from writers who are politically conservative on the right in recent years that you can think of that mattered? I mean, in the States, we have Tom Wolfe, we have Mark Halperin, a few others. I'm just wondering if
Tom Wolfe?
Tom Wolfe, yeah, he's quite conservative. Really? I mean, he has a myriad mind. I mean, he's not pigeonholed as a conservative, but I think he's conservative. Mark Halperin wrote Winter's Tale, and I'm trying to think of others. I'm just wondering if you're aware of any writers you respect who are on the right.
No, we don't respect them because they're on the right.
That's right.
Next.
Okay. Another question?
Sorry.
Yes.
My question is for Daniyal, and my question is, as a writer with Pakistani origin, are you expected to write about certain topics and themes to be published internationally? Do you feel the pressure to pander to Western sensibilities if you are to be published? Like, you can't write about music because you're Pakistani, you have to write about violence or certain themes. Do you feel that's true or not?
Look, that's not how it works. You don't write about a theme because it's something that, you know, will satisfy an audience. You write about a subject because it's what is compelling to you.
Anyone else? I guess I'll question.
It's sort of based on the writings of Daniyal Mueenuddin. I just started reading one of his books. You mentioned that politics or...
Hold it closer.
You mentioned that political writing is not really well received by sort of serious literary writers. So I would beg to disagree, because I just started reading Daniyal's book, and I find that's one of the most revolutionary books in English by a Pakistani author that I've read ever. And I think it's very, very powerful, because without overtly referring to politics, you have raised some very deep social, economic issues. And you should never underestimate the power of fiction. And even though it's in English, there's nothing to stop people from translating it so that it is received in a wider audience in Pakistan, in the native languages, like provincial languages as well as Urdu.
I think that one of the sort of, it's almost like an ancillary aspect of fiction, is that description is political. And that's what we do.
Yeah, I mean, when you were describing, you know, Daniyal's work and this submerged politics in it, he's sort of disavowing politics, but he also understands that the work is political. You know, when one person starts to talk to another with a romantic intent, you know, nobody sort of complains like, oh, but you've not used the word romance, or you've not used the word love, because you understand that what really matters in it, what's of real import in it, is in other words that are not so obvious, or even in the absence of words, in the nonverbal communication that happens. And yet nobody will say, well, that's not a real romance because you did not write a manifesto about love to your beloved. What? No. So I think many of the things that have the greatest force have to have an element of obliquity about them. You know, something has to happen tangentially. And I think that's also true of political writing.
But Teju, I mean, I think that's what distinguishes us from, you know, the couple when they're talking. For us, intentions are
we're
much
just
less
like lovers. We're just like lovers.
Just like that. No, I'm just saying that intentions are much less important in writing. It has to be embodied.
Yeah, but it depends on what the intention is. In love, it's towards a particular end goal, and in writing, it's to testify to a certain attitude to the world, to a certain set of circumstances. That's also the clear intent. The intent might not be to change the irrigation policy in Iowa State, you know, but to make a picture of the world and be accurate about it is political. You know.
Another question? Yes, sir. Microphone? Oh, I'm sorry. Next.
Thanks so much for the discussion. Teju mentioned the difference between hope and optimism, or he referred to it or alluded to it. And I just was
wondering, as writers, is this idea of hope and identifying hope or achieving hope in your readers something that you think about as you approach writing? Or is this a side effect or sort of something that happens because you write about something that you are passionate about and that just comes out in the writing? In other words, can hope be an inspiration for your writing, or is it something that is a side effect of your writing?
I always hope I'm going to write a really good book. But I don't think about my reader when I'm writing. I think about the story I'm telling and how I'm going to tell it. And that's mostly what I am concentrated on, because I don't think there is a reader for me, unless it is me. Although it isn't me, because one of the things I've learned is that readers can read a book very differently and get out of it some very different things from what I thought I was putting into it.
For me, I try to give a reader some option for ourselves, because I think I don't have something very specific future for me or for them. So I think it's really better for me to just give some option for them. It can be they can take it as a hope, or maybe many of them just maybe it's just treat or something that they can optimistic or simple being just something they can do, they try to do.
I'll just jump in. I think good writing always, as a critic, makes me optimistic about life and the world. I read for pleasure, and sometimes pain is pleasure. But just good sentences. You know, reading Mohsin Hamid's new book, it's a painful book, but it's deeply pleasurable in a kind of elegiac way. But I feel like I'm delivering to my readers, I hope, a sense of the joy that the written word can bring. And it's sort of like letting a light in dark times. I mean, I hope that my own writing is joyful to an extent that it imparts the joy that can be found in reading. And even the most painful writing for me is escapism to some degree, because it's firing parts of my mind that I find pleasure, and it's an escape for me from what's happening to some degree.
I mean, Dwight wouldn't toot his own horn, but he really is one of the best book critics in the world. Go to the New York Times website, search for Dwight Garner, and read any 3 reviews, and you would think, oh my God.
All right, enough paid announcement. Next question.
That's right. And now a word from our sponsor.
My question is for Gillian. You said that you read a lot of history. I was just wondering what kind of criteria you might have for, like, what makes a good history book, or what kind of history is something that you, a historical account is something that you rely on yourself?
I like a well-written book, so that's partly what makes a good book for me altogether. What draws me in, I like the sentences to work, and people who write history can be very dry and dull, and people can make the world live. So I think what I'm looking for is something that pulls me in with its language and with the way that it has been worked, and also sort of gives me an idea of what I'm searching for in that particular subject, which I think is slightly different from fiction, where you go into a book without preconceptions of what it is, go into a novel without preconceptions of what it is going to give you or what you are looking for in it. You follow the novelist into their book. And in non-fiction, you follow a non-fiction writer into a subject that you want to know more about. But for me, if it's well written, that's important to keep me in there.
Another question? Yes.
You know, in your books, it's often very allegorical. And within the Indonesian context, that's often very powerful because it's not as overtly political, and yet there are ideas about power relationships. So I just wondered if you could talk about your choices when you're in your writing, particularly your two novels, about those less obvious, almost mythical stories that in fact have a relationship to society.
Yeah, when I wrote these two novels, the first idea is to write something historical, about Indonesian history, but at the same time, I asked myself about what is history itself. There is people always talk about that there is a right and wrong. This kind of history is right and this kind of story is false, because after 32 years in the Suharto regime, the Suharto in power, there is a lot of, maybe we call it fake news, hoax or something like that. Because, for example, the even in the 65, for example. So when I try to write something about Indonesian history, I facing something. I question myself about what is his story. So I try to read a lot of book about Indonesian history, and in the end, I try to just write something very different. It's not a historical novel anymore. It's just about talking about history itself. History is not about what the book of history book told us, but about how the event, we see the events from the different perspective. For example, in the novel, there is a little story about the Independence Day. Indonesian Independence Day is 17th August, but in the novel it's the 23rd September, because people believe, people in the city in the novel believe that they became independent in the 23rd September. So they just celebrate that, not 17 August. It's just a perspective of how people see the event, the date, the history itself.
Hi, I just wanted to ask, are you mindful of stereotyping in your books when you're writing? Like, just like, actually, like, in today's world, there's so much to do with like stereotypes, and when you write, are you mindful of actually labeling things or like kind of buying into stereotypes? For instance, when you write about a character, perhaps.
Anyone?
I mean, I think this
This is one of the places where the person that you are in real life can really affect the person that you are on the page. You know, if you're not really open-minded and
sort of generous about other people in real life, it's hard to be that way on the page, which is why when we're asked for, you know, a right-wing novelist we like,
none. It'll just start to break down on that micro level. But I'll give you an example.
but it doesn't mean that then it's perfect. Doesn't mean you're free of any possible flaw. I'll give you an example that happened when I was writing a work of fiction. My editor was looking at it, you know, and I had written about my character that he saw an Indian woman on the subway. And my editor said, "How do you know she's Indian?" That's interesting. I said, "Well, I mean, she's Indian." Says, "Yeah, how does your character know she's Indian?" And then I had to sort of, you know, talk about either like a Desi woman or a woman of South Asian appearance. She could be Sri Lankan, obviously she could be Pakistani or Bangladeshi, you know. And that's like a very small example, but in the course of a fiction, if you want to show the harshness and difficulty of life, there's so many opportunities to do it that it actually doesn't cost you anything in the smaller and more seemingly trivial ways to be inclusive. And in fact, what that can do is that it can buy you time and it can buy you the reader's trust up to the point where you then release the trapdoor, if there is one.
Go ahead, Daniyal.
I was just going to say that about stereotypes. It seems to me that when you fall into the stereotype trap is when you don't know the thing very well, because when you know it well, then it is individual.
We are out of time. I'd like to end by maybe reverting from politics back to pleasure for a moment, because we all need more pleasure at this time as well. And if you could recommend each of you something that you care about right now in terms of culture, whether it's a magazine or a song, or it could be a book, something that's giving you pleasure and hope now, in any order.
Mine goes blank when I'm ever asked for lists.
What about a play you've seen recently? Something that's meant a lot to you, and maybe particularly so because it's right now.
Other people answer. I will think.
I know this sounds like a plug, but I found myself really moved by Mohsin's new book. That it made me think about this whole refugee thing in a different light, and made it individual and personal, and you know, I don't know. I read it and I've been thinking about it for a long time.
I think mine would be, there's a radio station in New Orleans, in the United States, called WWOZ, and you can stream it on your computer, and it's just beautiful American jazz and blues, and I find it just, when I'm sad, when I'm depressed, I'll cook dinner and put this music on from New Orleans, and it's so filled with joy that it changes my whole feeling about the world.
So I'm going to go from joy to the opposite of it. I've just finished a book which actually was given to review, which is a memoir of somebody from South Africa and of what happened to her sister in her marriage, which filled me actually with grief because it is such a painful story, but it was so well rendered.
What is it?
It's called Once We Were Sisters, Sheila Kohler.
Oh, Sheila Kohler, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And it also brought back to me the country that I had left as a child, in so beautifully rendered. Although I found it actually made me angry, and it made me upset, and it stayed with me. And
Eka, do you have anything you want to add?
It will give you some very different perspective about what in the world really happen nowadays, and it's nothing have to do with, for example, it's nationalism or far right. Just try to watch K-pop music. I think it's very different. So what nowadays happen.
Yep. You want to have the last word?
Actually, I don't, because I can think of the many different things that console me, but I can't think of something I would want to necessarily recommend. And that's not really like me. I'm having like inarticulacy issues. Do what you love, you know, take time out for it. Don't be afraid. I've been learning a lot about confronting what am I so afraid of, you know? Yeah. Not much anymore. So don't be afraid.
And then you find that that actually gives you quite a boost to be less fearful, personally, but also politically. So,
listen, thank you all for coming, and thank all of you. This was very enlightening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.